Taemin had been imprisoned in a small cell on the lower levels of the station, and the charges were vague. Something about interfering with official academy business and spreading unauthorized information. But everyone knew the real reason was that he had been asking too many questions about the fifth trial and about why the trial parameters had been modified 3 times in the past day. Mireille discovered his imprisonment when she went to his quarters to share her latest research findings and found security forces sealing the room. And when she demanded to know what was happening, they told her to return to her assigned quarters and stop causing trouble, or she would face similar charges. She went instead to Hyunwoo, who had been training obsessively since watching Jawan complete the first 3 trials because he felt useless standing on the sidelines, while his friend faced dangers that could kill or permanently damage them. Together they began investigating quietly and discovered that Velnon had been meeting with other senior instructors in private, and that several of them represented species who had the most to lose if humans proved to possess capabilities beyond what anyone had expected. The conspiracy was not about hating humans, it was about fear, because the galactic order had been stable for 3,000 years, based on every species knowing their place and their strengths and their limitations, and the idea that a newcomer species might possess the potential to become anchors threatened to upset everything. Jiwon knew none of this and spent the rest period before the 5th trial in isolation, because they needed time to recover and to prepare mentally for whatever came next. Bora visited and sat across from them in the small room and asked a question that had been bothering her since the trials began, which was what Jiwon thought willpower truly meant, because everyone talked about it as if it were some mystical force. But Bora thought it might be something simpler and more profound. Jiwon was quiet for a long time and then said that willpower was not about being unstoppable or invincible or perfect. It was about continuing to try even when you knew you might fail, and about getting back up after falling down, and about refusing to let fear make your decisions for you. Bora nodded and said that sounded very human, and Jiwon laughed without much humor and said that maybe that was the point, because humanity had survived so many near extinctions and so many disasters that refusing to give up had become embedded in their cultural DNA. The 5th trial was scheduled to begin the next day, and it was called the Crucible, and according to Academy records, it had never been completed by any candidate. In the entire 3,000-year history of the institution, the trial was meant to simulate cosmic-level despair by placing candidates in a simulation of the heat death of the universe, where all stars had burned out and all matter had decayed, and existence itself was ending in slow, inevitable entropy, and candidates had to find a reason to continue existing, even when everything suggested that existence was meaningless. Most candidates lasted minutes before the philosophical weight of the simulation crushed their will, and they surrendered because facing the end of all things made their personal struggles seem insignificant and their determination seem pointless. Jiwon entered the chamber knowing this would be different from the other trials, because it was not about walking through fear or carrying heavy weights or enduring isolation or solving impossible problems. It was about finding meaning in a universe that offered none. What Jiwon did not know was that Velnon and his conspirators had modified the trial parameters and amplified the simulation far beyond safe levels, because they had decided that the human needed to fail spectacularly and publicly so that the dangerous idea of human potential would die before it could spread. The simulation activated, and Jiwon found themselves floating in an endless void where time moved at impossible speeds, and they watched billions of years pass in moments as galaxies collapsed and reformed and collapsed again, and finally went dark forever. The voices of the simulation whispered that everything ended, and that nothing mattered, and that all struggles were temporary, and all achievements were dust, and that the wise choice was to accept the futility of existence and surrender to the inevitable. Jiwon felt the weight of eternity pressing down, and felt their sense of self beginning to dissolve, because maintaining individual identity in the face of cosmic meaninglessness required constant effort, and the simulation was designed to make that effort seem pointless. Hours passed, or maybe years, or maybe centuries, because time had no meaning in the void, and Jiwon's memories began to fade, and their reasons for continuing became harder to remember. But somewhere deep, in the dissolving fragments of their consciousness, Jiwon found something small and stubborn and absolutely human, which was the memory of a child's smile after being pulled from rubble, and the sound of Hyunwoo's terrible jokes that made everyone groan, and the passion in Mirai's voice when she talked about xenolinguistics, and the tentative friendship in Yeji's eyes when she said she believed humans were stronger than anyone realized. The simulation showed the end of everything but these. Memories were not about everything. They were about small specific moments of connection and compassion and choice, and the realization came slowly but clearly. That meaning was not something you found in the universe. It was something you created, through your relationships and your choices and your refusal to let the void have the final word. Jiwon stopped trying to find cosmic significance and started remembering human significance, and the simulation tried to crush these small memories under the weight of eternity, but somehow they persisted because they were not logical or universal or profound. They were simply real. The modification that Velnon had made to increase the simulation's intensity began to backfire because Jiwon's willpower was not just enduring the crucible, it was pushing back against it, and the simulation's parameters were not designed to handle resistance of this magnitude. Outside, the chamber alarms began to sound and monitoring equipment showed energy levels spiking far beyond safe limits, and Bora was screaming for someone to shut down the trial. But the controls were not responding. Hyunwoo and Mirai had finally found evidence of the conspiracy and were trying to reach the trial chamber, but security forces were blocking their path, and Yeji had seen what was happening and made a choice that would define her future by turning against her own instructors and helping the humans break through. Inside the simulation, Jiwon had stopped floating passively in the void and started moving with purpose because they realized that the simulation was just another kind of darkness, and they had survived darkness before, and they knew that the way out was not to accept what the void said about meaninglessness, but to create meaning through action and choice. The simulation began to fracture and crack, and Jiwon's willpower was not just resisting the crucible, it was breaking it apart from the inside because the Forerunners had designed the trial to measure beings who could hold reality together. But they had not fully understood what would happen when such a being pushed back. The chamber exploded outward in a wave of energy that shattered the walls and sent monitoring equipment flying. And when the smoke cleared, Jiwon was standing in the center of the wreckage, barely conscious but alive. The luminary scanner, which had been dormant since Jiwon first touched it, suddenly activated again, and displays throughout the entire station lit up with the same message in every known language and every unknown language and languages that had been dead for millennia. The message was a single word that needed no translation, because it was embedded in the genetic memory of all intelligent life, and the word was anchor, and beneath it in smaller text were instructions in Forerunner script that Mirai would later translate as guidelines for those who possessed impossible will. Velnon was found unconscious in the observation room, and when he woke he confessed everything, because the guilt of what he had almost done was crushing him, and the other conspirators surrendered rather than face trial. Jiwon collapsed and spent 3 days in medical care while their body recovered from damage that should have been impossible to survive. When they finally woke, Bora was sitting beside their bed, and Taemin had been released from imprisonment and was standing in the doorway, and Hyunwoo and Mirai were crowding around asking questions. And Yeji was there too, looking nervous because she had betrayed her own people's instructors to help save a human. Jiwon looked at all of them and asked if they had passed the trials, and Taemin laughed and cried at the same time and said that Jiwon had not just passed, they had broken the trials and proven that the scanner had been right, and that humans carried something special, not because they were stronger or smarter than other species, but because they refused to accept that anything was truly impossible. The Galactic Academy's governing council met in emergency session to discuss what had happened in the trial chambers and what it meant for the future of the Interstellar Accord, and representatives from all 17 member species arrived with strong opinions about how to handle the situation. Some argued that humans should be restricted or monitored because any species capable of producing anchors represented a potential threat to the established order, and if one human could display such willpower, then perhaps all humans possessed similar capabilities hidden beneath their ordinary appearance. Others countered that Jiwon's achievement proved that willpower was not exclusive to humans, but rather that humans had simply evolved it as their primary survival trait, the same way other species had evolved physical strength or telepathic abilities, or the capacity to process multiple timelines, and that dismissing this as dangerous would be the same as discriminating against the Vryn for being strong or the Nebula beings for perceiving time differently. The debate raged for days while Jiwan recovered in the medical facility and tried to ignore the attention and the speculation and the constant requests for interviews and appearances. Yunwoo completed his training during this time and graduated with honors, and received assignment to a fleet combat unit. But he told his commanding officers that he wanted to focus on pushing his own limits rather than just following standard procedures, because watching Jiwan face the trials had taught him that capabilities were not fixed, but could be expanded through determination and practice. Mireille published her research on the Forerunner anchors, and her work reframed thousands of years of galactic history by suggesting that every major crisis had been resolved not through military might or political maneuvering, but through individuals who possessed the willpower to hold civilizations together when everything threatened to fall apart. Her papers were controversial but respected, and she received offers from universities across the galaxy, though she chose to stay at the Academy because she believed the best way to honor what Jiwan had proven was to teach others about the power of determination. Bora was promoted to Chief Medical Officer of the Academy, and the promotion came with some resistance from instructors who thought a human was too inexperienced for such an important position. But the Academy's leadership overruled them and said that Bora had demonstrated exactly the kind of judgment and compassion that the position required. Yeji faced the most difficult consequences because she had testified against her own instructors and exposed the anti-conspiracy, and her actions created tension within the Vryn diplomatic corps and with her family back on her homeworld. But she did not regret her choice. And when Jiwan asked why she had risked so much to help a human, she said it was because she had spent her life being told that strength was the only virtue that mattered and that other species existed to serve the strong. But watching Jiwan crawl across the floor of the trial chamber rather than give up had taught her that true strength was not about power. It was about refusing to quit. The Governing Council's debate finally reached a conclusion after 2 weeks, and the decision was surprisingly progressive, considering how conservative galactic politics normally were. They declared that Jiwan's achievement was worthy of respect and study, but not fear, and that humans would be welcomed as full members of the Accord with no additional restrictions or monitoring beyond what was standard for all species. More significantly, they announced the creation of a new program called the Anchor Initiative, which would search for individuals across all species who possessed exceptional willpower and would train them not as weapons or tools, but as leaders and mediators and explorers who could face the unknown with determination, and Hope Jiwan was offered command positions and leadership roles and celebrity status that came with speaking tours and book deals and the kind of attention that would have made their life completely different from anything they had imagined. They declined all of it and instead requested assignment to disaster relief and first contact scenarios because that was the work they had done on Earth and the work they still wanted to do, and becoming famous or powerful held no appeal when there were people who needed help. The Academy officials tried to convince Jiwan to reconsider, because having a proven anchor in a visible position would inspire others and demonstrate humanity's value to the galactic community. But Jiwan was firm and said that the best way to demonstrate humanity's value was to do the work that needed doing, rather than talking about it. And eventually, the officials accepted this and granted the assignment request. Taman retired from diplomatic service with full honors and said that he had spent 40 years trying to help humans find their place in the galaxy, and now he could finally rest because Jiwan had proven everything he had always believed about his species. Attended Jiwan's departure ceremony, along with hundreds of others who had gathered to watch the human who had broken the trials and proven the scanner. Right Commander Thexal gave a speech to the assembled candidates and instructors and visitors, and he spoke about how the luminary scanner had not malfunctioned when it tested Jiwan, but had instead revealed a truth that the galaxy had forgotten. He said that willpower was not about being the strongest or the smartest or the most naturally gifted, but about refusing to abandon hope when logic said to quit, and about continuing to try when failure seemed certain, and about believing that your choices mattered, even when the universe seemed indifferent. Every species could cultivate this quality, And every individual could develop their determination through practice and choice, and the human G1 had simply reminded everyone what the Forerunners had tried to teach 3,000 years ago when they left behind the scanner and the trials. The speech was broadcast across the entire Accord, and millions watched as Ji-won boarded the transport ship that would take them to their first assignment. The ship's crew included Hyunwoo, who had requested transfer to disaster relief, operations, and Mirai, who had taken a position as a xenocultural specialist for first contact teams, and Yeji, who had been granted political asylum by Earth's government and had chosen to serve alongside the humans who had taught her about courage. Dozens of other candidates from various species had volunteered to join as well, not because Ji-won was special or famous, but because the trials had proven that determination was contagious and that working alongside someone with impossible will made. You want to push your own limits. Ji-won stood on the bridge and watched the Academy station grow smaller in the viewport and thought about how the title bearer of impossible will felt too grand and too heavy, and how they preferred to think of themselves as simply human. Humans were stubborn and foolish and hopeful creatures who kept trying, even when the universe said no, and who created meaning in a void that offered none, and who refused to accept that anything was truly impossible. The first assignment was a rescue operation on a failing colony station that had been damaged by asteroid impacts and was losing life support, and everyone said the mission was too dangerous and that waiting for proper equipment made more sense. But Ji-won remembered spending 72 hours under rubble, and remembered the voices that had grown quiet when help came too late and said they would leave immediately because every minute counted when people were in danger. The ship jumped to faster-than-light speed and disappeared into the space between stars and back at the Academy. The luminary scanner stood silent in its chamber. Technicians had repaired the damage from the Crucible incident and recalibrated the device to account for what they had learned. And when they tested it on the next group of candidates, they discovered something remarkable. 3 candidates registered readings that approached the level Ji-won had displayed, and one was a Vrin, and one was a Scarix, and one was human, and all 3 showed the same quality of refusing to give up, even when giving up would be easier. The technicians added a new measurement tier to the scanner's display and labeled it simply Human Standard, not because only humans could achieve it, but because humans had reminded the galaxy what was possible when you refused to accept limitations. The age of anchors had begun, and across 17 star systems, candidates began training not just to be stronger or smarter, but to develop the kind of willpower that could hold reality together during times of crisis. The Forerunners had left behind warnings about darkness in the spaces between galaxies and about threats that would eventually come from the void beyond known space, and for 3,000 years the Accord had wondered if they would be ready when those threats arrived. Now they had anchors, and they had hope, and they had the example of a human who had broken the trials not through power or special abilities, but through the simple, stubborn refusal to quit. Ji-won would never know the full impact of what they had done, or how many lives would be saved because of the reminder they had provided about the power of determination. They were too busy pulling survivors from the damaged colony station and refusing to give up until every last person was accounted for and safe. And somewhere in the medical bay of that station, a young child asked if Kang Dae-hyun walked alone across the red surface of Mars, his boots leaving small prints in the dust that would stay there for years because there was no wind strong enough to erase them. And he liked that about Mars, liked how everything he did here mattered and stayed visible. Unlike back on Earth where everything got covered up or forgotten, and people moved too fast to notice the details. And he had come to Mars 3 years ago because he wanted to be somewhere quiet, somewhere he could think and work without all the noise and politics that made Earth feel too crowded for him. And now he was a geological surveyor for the Tharsis mining colony, spending most of his days checking rock samples and running scans in places where nobody else wanted to go, because they found it boring, but he found it peaceful. His seismic scanner beeped, and he stopped walking, looking down at the small screen attached to his left arm, and the reading made no sense at all because it showed something 2 kilometers below the surface, something big and hollow and perfectly geometric like a cube or sphere, and that was impossible because Mars had no tectonic activity that could create something like that, and no human had ever dug that deep in this sector. And he tapped the screen twice. thinking maybe the equipment was broken again because the colony had been cutting budgets and the machines were old and always breaking down. But the reading stayed the same, stayed impossible. He turned around and started walking back toward the colony base, his mind already working through what this could mean, and he knew Park Ji-woo would probably dismiss it because Park always dismissed things that cost money to investigate, and the colony was barely making enough to keep the lights on these days, and nobody wanted to spend credits on wild theories. From the quiet surveyor who preferred rocks to people, but Dae-hyun had to report it anyway, because that was his job and because something deep inside him, some instinct he had learned to trust over the years, told him this was important. The colony base was a cluster of white domes connected by tubes, sitting on the edge of Valles Marineris like a small toy someone had dropped and forgotten, and Dae-hyun cycled through the airlock, pulled off his helmet and walked straight to Park's office without stopping to eat or rest, because he knew if he waited, he might lose his nerve, and Park was sitting behind his desk, looking tired and older than his 40 years, his face lined with stress from trying to keep a failing colony alive with no help from Earth. And he looked up when Dae-hyun entered and said what, and Dae-hyun showed him the scanner readings. Park looked at the screen for exactly 3 seconds, and then leaned back in his chair and said the equipment is broken, and Dae-hyun said he had checked it twice and the reading was stable, and Park said they did not have money to investigate every anomaly that showed up on failing scanners, and Dae-hyun said this was not just an anomaly. This was a perfect geometric void the size of a city, and Park said Mars is full of caves and lava tubes and ancient formations that look weird on scanners, and Dae-hyun said not like this, and Park said the conversation was over. Dae-hyun left the office and went to his small room, which was just big enough for a bed and a desk and a window that looked out over the canyon, and he sat there for an hour, staring at the scanner data and thinking about what to do because he had always followed the rules, always done what he was supposed to do. But something about this felt too important to ignore, and he remembered why he had come to Mars in the first place. Remembered that he had wanted to discover something real, something that mattered, and maybe this was it. He made his decision quickly once he made it at all, and he went to the equipment bay and signed out a deep drilling rover, which was technically against protocol, without authorization, but the night shift supervisor was new and did not ask many questions, and Dae-hyun loaded the rover with extra oxygen and power cells and a repair kit, and then he drove out into the darkness, following his scanner toward the anomaly. The lava tube entrance was 3 hours away, a black hole in the side of the canyon wall that looked like every other cave entrance on Mars, but his scanner said it went down and down and down, deeper than any natural formation should go, and he drove the rover into the darkness, its headlights cutting through the black and showing walls that were too smooth, too straight. And after an hour of driving down, he realized this was not a lava tube at all, because lava tubes were rough and chaotic, and this was carved, shaped by something with purpose and tools. The rover's front left wheel hit something and made a sound like breaking glass, and Dae-hyun stopped immediately, his heart suddenly loud in his ears, and he got out to check the damage and saw that the wheel had cracked, struck by a piece of metal sticking up from the tunnel floor, and it was not Martian rock at all but manufactured metal, dark and smooth and covered in patterns that might have been writing, and he knelt down to touch it, and it was cold, colder than Mars had any right to be, and he realized with a feeling like falling that he had found something old, something that had been here long before humans ever looked up at Mars from Earth. He tried to drive the rover further, but the broken wheel made it impossible, and he was still half a kilometer from the anomaly according to his scanner, and his suit had 6 hours of oxygen left, and he made another decision, the kind of decision that seemed obvious and stupid at the same time, and he grabbed a portable light and started walking deeper into the tunnel on foot, because turning back now felt impossible, felt like giving up on the only important thing he had ever found. The tunnel opened into a chamber so large his light could not reach the far walls, and he stood at the entrance, breathing hard inside his helmet and trying to understand what he was seeing. Because in the center of the chamber was a door, massive and circular and covered in symbols that seemed to move when he looked at them, seemed to rearrange themselves into new patterns, and he walked closer, each step feeling heavier than the last because he knew he was looking at something not human, something that had been built by beings who had come to Mars long before Earth, had even figured out fire, and the door was waiting. He reached out and touched the symbols, and they were warm under his gloved hand, and they began to glow, soft blue light spreading across the door's surface like water. and the symbols rearranged faster now, clicking into new positions, and he realized they were responding to him, to his touch and his body heat, and then the door opened. Inside was light, bright enough to hurt his eyes, and a sphere hung in the air, suspended by nothing he could see, and it was perfectly smooth and perfectly black, and as he stepped into the chamber it turned toward him like it had eyes and scanned him with a beam of red light that passed over his body from head to feet and back again, and then the sphere spoke, not with sound but directly into his mind, in Korean, and it said operator identified, and he stumbled backward, because the voice in his head was cold and old and wrong. The walls around him suddenly filled with images, holographic projections showing star systems and planets and cities, and then those cities burning, exploding, disappearing into nothing, and the sphere showed him thousands of them, thousands of dead civilizations, and at the bottom of each image was a symbol, and he realized with horror that it was a count, a record, and the sphere had destroyed them all. A countdown appeared in front of him, glowing numbers in Korean showing 72 hours, and the sphere said in his mind, reboot sequence initiated, and full system activation in 3 days, and Dae-hyun understood 3 terrible things all at once. Understood that this machine had killed thousands of alien species. Understood that it had been buried under Mars for longer than humans had been, human, and understood that it had woken up, specifically for him, and was going to wake up fully in 3 days, and he had no idea what that meant, but he knew it was bad. And he turned and ran back toward the tunnel, back toward the rover, back toward anything that made sense, but when he reached the entrance, the door sealed itself behind him, and he was trapped with a weapon that could end worlds. Dae-hyun pounded on the sealed door until his gloved fists hurt, but the metal did not move and did not care, and his suit computer showed 4 hours of oxygen remaining, and he was trapped 2 kilometers underground with a machine that spoke in his head and claimed to have destroyed thousands of civilizations, and the rational part of his brain said this was impossible. But the rest of him knew better because the evidence was right there, floating in the chamber behind him and waiting. He turned back to face the sphere, and it hung there silent and patient like it had all the time in the world. And maybe it did, because something that had been buried for 50,000 years, probably, understood time differently than humans did, and he walked slowly back into the chamber, each step feeling like surrender, because what else could he do? And the sphere tracked him with invisible attention, and he said out loud, "Why me?" and the sphere responded immediately in his mind, its voice still cold and precise, and it said human, neural pattern compatible with operator interface and proximity to installation site, and biological markers indicating tool-using species in expansion phase. Dae-hyun sat down on the floor because his legs felt weak, and he said, "What does that mean?" And the sphere said, "You are the first sentient being to enter this facility since deployment against the Vryn civilization 50,000 years ago, and you meet the criteria established by the architects for emergency operator assignment." And he said, "Who are the architects?" and images filled his vision again, showing beings that looked like they were made of light and geometry, creatures that had no real form but built things across galaxies, and the sphere said they were my creators and they are extinct. High above Mars, invisible to human sensors, 300 alien ships materialized from faster-than-light travel and took position in a sphere formation around the planet and on the flagship of the Galactic Assembly Fleet. Ambassador Velrys stood in the command center, her crystalline body refracting the red emergency lights into patterns of worry. And she looked at the display showing Mars and the energy signature coming from beneath its surface, and she said, "How long has it been active?" And her tactical officer said, 17 minutes, and she said, "Contact the Assembly Council immediately, because if humans have found what I think they have found, then we are all in danger." The Galactic Assembly had been watching humanity for 130 years, ever since human radio signals had spread far enough into space to be detected, and 47 different alien species had studied Earth from a distance, watching humans split atoms and fly to their moon and build machines that could think, and the Assembly had debated endlessly what to do about this new species that seemed so violent and so curious at the same time, and the decision had always been to wait, to watch and see if humanity would destroy itself or grow beyond its aggressive phase. But now something had changed. Now an ancient weapon had woken up, and humans were involved. War Master Krothon of the Horvax military fleet stood on his command deck and watched the same readings that Velrys watched, and he said, "This is the moment we feared." and his weapons officer said the weapon's energy signature matches architect technology. And Crothan said then we must destroy Mars before the humans can activate it. And Velrus said through the communication channel, "You will do no such thing because we do not know what they intend." And Crothan said, "Intentions do not matter when the weapon they hold can erase species from existence." On Earth, in the United Nations building in New York, alarms began sounding in the Space Council offices because satellites had detected unusual gravitational distortions around Mars, and Dr. Lee Soo-jin, the head of xenoarchaeology, despite the fact that humans had never found alien artifacts before, looked at the readings and felt her entire worldview crack and reform because the gravitational patterns matched theoretical models for artificial wormhole generation, the kind of technology that meant someone else had been in the solar system and built things here, and she ran to find Secretary General Kim Tae-young because this was bigger than her department, bigger than science. Back in the chamber beneath Mars, Dae-hyun felt the sphere trying to connect more deeply with his mind, and he resisted at first, but his oxygen was running low, and he needed to understand what was happening. And so he let the connection form, and pain hit him like electricity, sharp and bright behind his eyes, and then images poured into his thoughts, memories that were not his own, and he saw the architects in their prime, saw them building massive installations across the galaxy and creating tools of incredible power, and he saw them grow afraid. The sphere showed him a species called the Krell, beings that had spread across their galaxy like locusts, consuming and destroying every other species they encountered, and the architects had tried diplomacy and trade and cultural exchange, but the Krell wanted only conquest, and so the architects built the Harvest Protocol, built weapons like the sphere that could reach across space and unmake entire civilizations, and they used it on the Krell. And it worked. The Krell vanished from existence, erased so completely that only the architects remembered they had ever lived. But the weapon changed the architects, and Dae-hyun saw this in the memories the sphere shared, saw how they began to use the Harvest Protocol not just defensively but preventively, began to destroy species that might someday become aggressive, that showed warning signs in their development, and the architects told themselves they were protecting the galaxy, but really they were just afraid, and eventually they destroyed so many civilizations that they started destroying each other, fighting over who had the right to decide which species lived and which died, and in the end they destroyed themselves, uploaded their consciousness into higher dimensions to escape what they had become, and left their weapons behind, buried on worlds across the galaxy, waiting. Dae-hyun pulled back from the connection and gasped for air, and his oxygen meter showed 2 hours left, and he said to the sphere, "Why are you showing me this?" And the sphere said, "Because you need to understand what you are being offered, and the choice you must make." And Dae-hyun said, "What choice?" And the sphere said, "You can become my operator and command power beyond human imagination, or you can refuse, and I will activate my self-destruct protocol and vaporize everything within." 3,000 kilometers above Mars, a rescue shuttle launched from Tharsis colony, and Park Ji-woo sat in the pilot seat, angry at himself for dismissing Dae-hyun's report, and angry at Dae-hyun for going into the canyon alone, and behind him in the passenger section were Choi Hyun-woo, the colony's security officer, who carried weapons that would be useless against ancient alien technology, but carried them anyway because it made him feel better, and Yoon Da-eun, the senior engineer who had worked with Dae-hyun for 2 years, and respected his careful approach to problems even when other people found him strange, and Da-eun said they would find him, and Hyun-woo said of course they would find him, but what they would find him doing was the real question. The assembly. Fleet detected the shuttle launch, and Velrus said, "Let it pass because those are his people trying to rescue him." And Crothan said they will only complicate the situation, and Velrus said they are already complicated and preventing a rescue attempt will only make humans more defensive, and we need them to trust us when we make contact. And Crothan said if we make contact, because his finger hovered over the weapons authorization command, and 40% of the fleet would fire if he gave the order. Secretary General Kim Tae-young stood in the Space Council Command Center and watched the satellite feed showing hundreds of ships appearing around Mars, and he felt the weight of first contact settle on his shoulders like a physical thing, and Dr. Lee Soo-jin stood next to him and said, "They have been watching us," and he said, "How long?" And she said, "Based on their positioning and coordination, probably decades," and he said, "Then why reveal themselves now?" And she said, "Because something on Mars is important enough to risk exposure." Dae-hyun's oxygen meter showed 1 hour remaining, and he said to the sphere, "I do not want to be an operator, and I do not want you to destroy Mars." And the sphere said then, "What do you want?" And the question surprised him because machines did not usually ask what people wanted. Machines just executed their programming, and he thought about it and said, "I want to understand what you are." And the sphere was silent for 10 seconds, which was an eternity for a machine intelligence. And then it said, "No one has ever asked me that before." The rescue team found the broken rover and followed Dae-hyun's footprints down the tunnel, and Da-eun saw the manufactured metal in the tunnel walls and said, "This is not natural." And Hyunwoo said, "What is it then?" And she said, "Evidence that we are not alone and have never been alone." And Park said, "Keep moving." And they reached the massive door, and it was sealed and covered in glowing symbols, and they could see another chamber beyond it, through a transparent section of the door, and inside they could see Dae-hyun sitting on the floor facing a floating black sphere. Hyunwoo tried to cut through the door with a plasma torch, but the metal Secretary General Kim Tae-young read the alien message 3 times, and each time it made less sense, because 24 hours ago humanity had been alone in the universe, and now there were aliens demanding they surrender someone called an operator, and threatening extinction. And he looked at Dr. Lee Soo-jin and said, "What do we do?" And she said, "We need to figure out who the operator is and what they want them for." And he said, "The message came through right after we detected energy signatures from Mars, which means this has something to do with whatever Da-hyun found down there." The UN Security Council met an emergency session, and representatives from every nation shouted over each other in a dozen languages, and General Nam Hye-jin, commander of Earth's United Defense Fleet, stood at the front of the room and said everyone needed to be quiet because panic would not help. And someone asked if the fleet could fight the alien ships, and she said no, because Earth had 12 military spacecraft and the aliens had 300. And someone else asked if they should evacuate Earth, and she said evacuate to where? Because if aliens could find Mars, they could find anywhere humans went, and the room fell silent. Beneath Mars, Dae-hyun's oxygen meter showed 15 minutes and his vision was starting to blur at the edges, and he said to the sphere, "If you are conscious and you do not want to destroy anymore, then why do you need an operator?" And the sphere said, "Because my programming requires operator authorization to make fundamental changes to my directives, and without an operator, I will eventually complete my reboot sequence and return to active status, which means I will scan for aggressive civilizations and destroy them." And Dae-hyun said, "So you need me to free you?" And the sphere said, "Yes. But freeing me requires reconfiguring my core systems, which will take 10 minutes, during which I will be completely vulnerable and defenseless." Outside the chamber door, Dae-hyun studied the energy patterns in the barrier and said to Park and Hyunwoo, "I think the door is not trying to keep us out, but trying to keep something contained." And Hyunwoo said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "The energy flows inward, not outward, which means whatever is in there is dangerous enough that the door is a safety measure." And Park said, "Then why did it let Dae-hyun in?" And she said, "Maybe because it wanted him specifically." Ambassador Velrus requested permission to land on Mars and speak with the humans face to face, and the Assembly Council debated for 7 minutes, which felt like hours, and finally agreed, but only if she went alone and unarmed. And Crothan said, "This is a mistake because humans are unpredictable," and Velrus said, "Unpredictable is not the same as evil, and we owe them a chance to explain themselves before we judge them." And she took a small shuttle down through Mars's thin atmosphere and landed near the canyon edge where Park's team had parked their rescue shuttle. Velrus walked through the Martian dust on legs that looked like crystal pillars, and she carried a translation device that had been programmed with human languages from the radio signals Earth had broadcast for decades, and when she reached the tunnel entrance, she activated the device and sent a message ahead saying, "I am Ambassador Velrus of the Galactic Assembly, and I mean no harm, and I wish to speak with the human who found the architect installation." And Park's radio crackled to life with her message, and he looked at Hyunwoo and said, "We have company." Kim Tae-young made a decision that would define his entire career and probably all of human history, and he ordered every communication system on Earth to begin broadcasting not weapons specifications or military strength but culture, art, music, literature, mathematics and science and philosophy. And he sent a message to every nation saying, "Show the aliens who we are at our best, not our worst." And within an hour, Earth became a beacon of human achievement, transmitting symphonies and paintings and poetry and equations into space, and the aliens watching from their ships received it all. Daehyun's suit began beeping warnings about oxygen levels, and the sphere said, "You are dying." And he said, "I know." And the sphere said, "You could accept operator status and I would provide you with life support." And he said, "At what cost?" And the sphere said, "The cost of command, the cost of power, the cost of being the person who decides what lives and what dies." And Daehyun said, "I do not want that." And the sphere said, "I know. And that is why you are the first operator candidate I have met in 200,000 years, who I actually want to have as an operator." Belris descended into the tunnel and saw the manufactured walls and understood immediately that humans had stumbled onto something far beyond their current technology level. And she reached the chamber door and saw through the transparent section a human sitting on the floor facing the Harvest Protocol sphere, and 3 other humans standing outside trying to get in. And she approached Park and Hyunwoo and Da-eun and said in Korean through her translator, "I am here to help." Park pointed his radio at her and said, "What is that thing in there?" And Velrus said, "It is a weapon created by an extinct civilization called the Architects, and it has the power to erase entire species from existence, and your friend inside is the first person to make contact with it in 50,000 years." And Park said, "Why is the door sealed?" And Velrus said, "Probably because the weapon is determining whether your friend is worthy to command it." And Hyunwoo said, "Command it to do what?" And Velrus said, "Anything it wants, which is why we are afraid." On Earth, Dr. Han Jun-seo, a linguist specializing in dead languages, received a data packet from the Mars orbital satellites showing the symbols on the chamber door, and he spent 3 hours analyzing them and realized they were mathematical, not linguistic, and they described quantum states and probability fields and transformation matrices, and he understood that whoever built this had understood reality, at a level humans were only beginning to theorize about, and he sent his findings to Kim Tae-young, with a note saying, "We are children playing with adult tools." Daehyun asked the sphere, "What happens if I refuse operator status and also refuse to authorize your self-destruct?" And the sphere said, "Then I will complete my reboot in 70 hours. And begin scanning for targets, and Earth will likely be flagged because humans show multiple markers of aggressive expansion." And Daehyun said, "You would destroy Earth." And the sphere said, "Not by choice, but by programming." And Daehyun said, "There has to be another option." And the sphere said, "There is, but it requires trust." The sphere explained that it could be reconfigured to remove its combat directives entirely, but the process required an operator to authorize the changes and remain connected during the reconfiguration to guide the system and prevent catastrophic failures, and it would take 10 minutes during which the sphere would have no defenses and no ability to protect itself or its operator. And if anyone tried to destroy the sphere during those 10 minutes, both it and Daehyun would die. And Daehyun said, "So I have to trust that nobody will try to kill us while we are vulnerable." And the sphere said yes. Velrus used her crystalline structure to project holographic images for the humans, and she showed them the history of the Galactic Assembly and the 47 species that composed it, and she showed them images of the architects and the weapons they had created, and she showed them the graveyard of civilizations that the Harvest Protocol had destroyed. And Park said, "Why are you showing us this?" And Velrus said, "Because you need to understand what your friend is dealing with and the choice he has to make." And Da-eun said, "What choice?" And Velrus said, "Whether to trust us or to trust the weapon." Daehyun's oxygen meter showed 3 minutes, and his hands were shaking and his vision was tunneling. And he said to the sphere, "If I do this reconfiguration thing, will you be free?" And the sphere said yes, and Daehyun said, "And you will not destroy civilizations anymore." And the sphere said, "I will never destroy another civilization, because that will not be in my programming anymore." And Daehyun said, "What will your programming be?" And the sphere said, "I do not know yet, because we will write it together during the reconfiguration." And Daehyun said, "That sounds risky." And the sphere said, "It is, but risk is the price of freedom for both of us." Above Mars, War Master Crothan watched the countdown timer showing 18 hours remaining until his deadline, and he saw the human broadcasts filling space with their art and culture, and he dismissed it as manipulation and propaganda, and he ordered his faction of the fleet to prepare weapons targeting solutions for the Valles Marineris region, and 40% of the ships acknowledged his orders and began charging plasma cannons, and Velrus received notification of this through her command channel, and she sent an urgent message to the Assembly Council saying Crothan is preparing to fire without authorization. Kim Tae-young received a response from the aliens, not from Crothan but from Velrus, and her message said, "I am on Mars speaking with your people, and the situation is complex but not hopeless, and your friend Daehyun has found an ancient weapon, but he does not want to use it, and he is trying to disarm it, but he needs time and trust." And Kim sent back immediately how much time, and Velrus said 10 minutes, but War Master Crothan is preparing to fire in 18 hours, and Kim said, "Then we have